Good morning, everyone. I know that people are still coming in, but I'd like to get our program started because I'm the least interesting part of it. I'm Julie Rowe. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Concord Carlisle. On behalf of our league, I would like to welcome you all to the second episode of our First Friday series, held this month on the second Friday of November. I'm reliably informed that we will not continue this pattern, so our December meeting will be on the first Friday, December 4th, and will be a conversation with Concord Public Works Director Alan Cathcart and other members of the Department of Public Works talking about water and other public works matters of interest. Our guest today is Carol Rose, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, and our moderator this morning will be Diane Proctor, who is chair of the LWVCC Concord Town Government Committee, which organizes the First Friday series. Since our founding in 1920, the League of Women Voters has worked to foster civic engagement and enhance access to voting. The League is a nonpartisan organization and does not support or oppose any candidate or political party. The program this morning is being recorded and will be available on our website and probably on the Minuteman Media Network YouTube channel next week sometime. And I will now turn our meeting over to Diane Proctor, who will introduce our speaker and tell us how the meeting's going to run. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Julie, so much. Indeed, my name is Diane Proctor, and I welcome everyone from our league and from other leagues. It is a privilege to have you all part of this discussion. I want to begin by establishing some protocols. All of your mics will be turned off, and only after Carol has spoken will you be individually able to unmute yourself. So don't try during the conversation, and understand if you have a question that emerges as Carol is speaking, you can enter your questions in the chat box. And Carlin Reed, the first vice president of our league, will be watching that chat box and recording questions that may come up and making sure that Carol has a chance to answer as many of those as possible. As well, there is a very easy system under the icon called participants, in which you should be able to raise your hand. And if you don't see that, it should be right there, and it would give you a chance to mechanically raise your hand so that we can call on you if there's something you would like to contribute to the discussion. Our speaker today is the remarkable Carol Rose. I've had the privilege of knowing her for several years, but most importantly, she is here today because of the invitation given by Nancy Bucas, our remarkable Nancy Bucas, who is, I think, has been involved with the ACLU for many years, and was the first to realize that when we needed to bring someone in after this election to help us sort out what's going on, that Carol Rose would be the exact person to invite, and then Carol graciously agreed to do so. For 17 years, she has been the executive director for the Massachusetts ACLU. She brings not only an abundance of experience as a lawyer and a journalist, but as a woman, and as someone who pays close attention to the inequities that may or may not exist in the legal systems and those people who need the support of something as important as the ACLU. The ACLU has been a wonderful partner with the League of Women Voters. And together we have undertaken several lawsuits, in fact, many lawsuits over time, that work on behalf of voters. So with no longer needing to hear from me, let's turn to Carol. And Carol, we welcome you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie, Diane, Nancy, and everyone who came out, all of you who are here for coming out and for the work that you do year in and year out to defend and strengthen our democracy. So when Nancy Bucas called me to see if I'd offer a few remarks on voting rights post-election, I was delighted. You know, I always think of the League of Women Voters and the ACLU as supportive, nonpartisan sister organizations. We share a birthday. Both of our organizations turned 100 years old or young this year. So a couple of good things out of 2020. You know, both organizations turned 100 this year, and both have never been more relevant or important to our democracy. So I'm going to do my best to share with you what I know, as up to the date as I can be, and then I really want to leave time to open it up and to hear from all of you and hear your voices, because that's how I learned. So here's the headline. We all know, right? Voters elected Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to be president and vice president of the United States. Kamala Harris is going to be the first woman VP. She'll be the first Black VP, the first Asian VP. It's historic. So we are all witness to history in the making right now. Here's another historic headline: voter turnout. You know, in the face of a pandemic, in the face of moves to dismantle the US Post Office, at a time of mail-in ballots, after the US Supreme Court have dismantled the Voting Rights Act in many ways, and in the face of actual rampant efforts to disenfranchise tens of millions of voters in the battleground states over the last 4 years, despite all those obstacles, American voters nonetheless showed up to vote. It was historic. 65% of eligible voters went to the polls, and that number is apparently going to rise as they continue to count votes. 42 states saw record voter turnout. So we're all witness to history right now, and I think we need to pause and say, yay, that this happened. And even better, they were fair, well-run, and clean elections. If you have a chance, today's New York Times front page, a story by David Sanger, Matt Stevens, and Nicole Perlroth starts like this, quote, "Hours after President Trump repeated a baseless report that a voting machine system deleted 2.7 million Trump votes nationwide, he was directly contradicted by a group of federal, state, and local election officials who issued a statement on Thursday declaring flatly the election was, quote, the most secure in history, and that, quote, there's no evidence any voting systems were compromised." Now, this statement wasn't sent by the Democratic Party. It was sent by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, which is responsible for helping states to secure the voting process. So yeah, we are witnesses to history. And at the same time, and especially with the League and the ACLU working together, we are shapers of history. You know, I think we need to really lift up and honor the role historically, not just this election, but over time, of our poll workers and our poll watchers. And that's where the League and all of you at the League have just been so crucial. This election was exciting in that we saw a whole new generation of activists, of poll workers and election monitors. At one point, there were enough poll workers in Massachusetts. The positions were filling up as young people stepped up to volunteer to help. And not just young people, lots of people. And the ACLU, also with the League of Women Voters and a coalition of groups called the Election Protection Coalition, we all worked together to then begin to train nonpartisan poll watchers, election protection poll watchers. And it was amazing to see the turnout. We trained up more than 1,600 people who volunteered to go out on election day, whether in their cars or to work online or to go out directly at the polls to show up and to make sure that people could exercise their right to vote. That's 4 times more volunteers than we've had. I mean, we've been doing election protection work with the League and Common Cause and all the other groups for years, but we had 4 times as many volunteers this year. We're seeing a really thickening, a strengthening of our democracy right now, as people realize that if they don't pay attention, if they don't get involved and engaged, that authoritarianism can take over, that we're not immune to the dangers of tyranny in this country, that we have to show up like the people of Concord and Lexington. I'm from Lexington, just saying. Concord and Lexington and Carlisle. I'm bringing them in too. Showed up, you know, all those years ago to in a minute, to stand up against tyranny. And we're seeing that and we're shaping that history. So thank you to the League for the work that you do in terms of election protection. And I want to also lift up Secretary of State Bill Galvin's office, and especially Michelle Tessaneri, who's his voting rights person there. She represents and they represent the best of our civil servants, and kind of keep our faith in government. They took our calls from our election protection team. We worked with them, in advance. Clean and fair elections don't just happen. They're a result of actual hard work, like day in and day in work, from groups like the ACLU and the League of Women Voters. Last June, we actually went to and worked with Secretary of State Galvin's office, and Michelle Tessaneri in particular, and members of the state legislature to draft legislation that would, in the midst of a pandemic, enable people to get absentee ballots, because our Constitution actually, we need a constitutional amendment arguably to fix this. Our Constitution says you can only have an absentee ballot if you verify that you're out of the state, you're gone, that you have a religious reason, which is kind of weird, but it's probably like you can't vote on be required to vote on a Saturday or a Sunday or a Friday, whatever. And then the third one is you have a disability and you can't vote. Well, so we were able to get legislation that basically interpreted that constitutional clause to say that a disability includes being threatened by COVID, right? But we should fix that. Like, there's no reason that we shouldn't have mail-in ballots all the time. Other states do it all the time. Like, we can fix that. That's a good learning and a good lesson that we can take from our election protection work and from working with our elected officials to do law reform that makes sure that people have the ability to vote in person, not just by mail, but in person, by mail, early, and to register on election day. That was one of the things that our election protection people, we got some reports of. There were people who had gone into the, whether the RMV, Registry of Motor Vehicles, or into their WIC place, and they thought they'd check the box that says, please register me automatically to vote. And then they got to the polls and they weren't on the list. So election day registration would fix that. So there's a lot of great work going on here in Massachusetts about election protection and also around the country. So the ACLU, like the League, exists in all 50 states, right? We don't just work in Massachusetts. And so when you're, I don't know about how the League works exactly, but when you're an ACLU member in Massachusetts, you're an ACLU member everywhere. So, and we share money and all that. So it works really well. And that means I have colleagues in all 50 states, and especially in those battleground states. So the ACLU really put a lot of work and money into the battleground states, especially Pennsylvania and Georgia, Wisconsin and Michigan, on voter protection efforts, not just on election day, but actually starting back in 2016 and even before that. So I'd love to tell there were like, the voting rights program of the National ACLU, I think, brought 33 cases in 20 states. And so things like defending the use of a drop box in Pennsylvania, or the drive-by drop boxes in Harris County, Texas, which you probably read about right before the election, and a requirement that eligible voters be sent voter registration applications in Arizona and Michigan. So there was a lot going on there in terms of that. In fact, overall, the ACLU lawsuits enabled 154 million Americans to vote. It was in those battleground states that they protected that. That's like 247 votes in the Electoral College. That's not just witnessing history, that's making history, right? That's real law reform and democracy reform work. But I just want to say though, I have this like special place in my heart for my counterpart in Atlanta, Georgia, Andrea Young. She became the executive director of the Georgia ACLU. She's the daughter of Andrew Young, who some of you may remember from Martin Luther King. Anyway, Andrea came in, she's about my age, 4 years ago. So, and she said to me, she said, you know, the ACLU is trying to get me to do all these multi-issue things here in Georgia. And there's only one thing I care about, and it's voting rights. If we get the vote, everything else we can get, but if we don't have the vote, it doesn't matter. And she did a full court press to get people who'd been pushed off the voter rolls to be re-enrolled wrongly. They did huge behind the scenes work. And she said to me the day after the election, when I called to congratulate her, and we were kept talking about it all, of course, she said, Stacy inspired them to vote, but the ACLU of Georgia ensured they were able to do so. Wow. And I just thought that is a case study in movement advocacy. That's the kind of work we need to always be doing, not just at a time of crisis. So there are similar stories in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona of this kind of heroism on the front lines that's really happening to ensure the right to vote. So I just want to like share that with you and share my gratitude to the League of Women Voters and everybody who showed up for the right to vote. And we really had a moment where the tools of democracy were stronger than the forces of authoritarianism and racism that continue to infect our world at this moment at a presidential election level. So now what? Well, the good news again is the cruel and venal and pernicious person and his cronies have been voted out of the central seat of power. But there's a lot of time now between now and January 20th, Inauguration Day. It feels long, 68 days, 2 hours, 33 minutes.
Not that you're counting, Carol.
I have a counter on my computer. Oh, and we all remain on high alert and we're all paying attention. You, I know, have heard, and we all have heard, how Trump's cronies have turned to the courts trying to file lawsuits demanding recounts in key battleground states. And let me just reassure you, legally, his lawsuits are bogus. They're just bogus. He's filed dozens of lawsuits, and we don't see any of them as plausibly affecting enough votes or states that could throw the outcome of the election. You know, Trump hasn't even made enough allegations affecting a sufficient number of ballots that would actually change the Electoral College victory, right? So, you know, rest assured, ACLU attorneys are ready. We have model papers and post-election litigation and scenarios. You know, it's like scenario 9's being called. Like, let's all get ready. It's really interesting to watch how everybody geared up. But I guess I want to say that setting aside the law, I think math is on the side of the Biden and Harris victory. The margins in the key battleground states are really clear. Just check this out. It's a margin of 20,000 votes in Wisconsin, 54,000 votes in Pennsylvania, 148,000 votes in Michigan, and 14,000 votes in Georgia, 11,000 in Arizona. You know, the New York Times reported that, it was funny, some reporter wrote, the New York Times and the other news media outlets have not anointed Mr. Biden the winner of the presidential election. They have just done the math. So
Yes.
oh, that was great. That was like a news story. And as a former journalist, I was like, kind of opinion sneaking in there, but okay, but I agree. The point is, this is not Bush v. Gore redux, right? The winning margin in that vote was 537 votes, right? Like the math isn't there. The law isn't there. So what about the politics? Can the politics change things, right? And there are a lot of people who are surmising that this is an effort to create confusion and sort of flip the vote to the Republican state legislatures to decide, because there'll be chaos and the electors won't be able to get their votes submitted by December 14th, and somehow it would flip to the state legislatures. From everything I can tell, and I did some research before talking to you all because I don't want to mislead anybody. I think this is really unlikely to work. It's a real monkey wrench effort. I think local legislative leaders in Pennsylvania and Michigan have already vowed publicly that they won't go along with the scheme. The governors will not, certify it. They're Democrats. Secretary of States aren't going to go with it. Now, that doesn't mean it can't gum up the works for a while if he tries. But here too, I mean, we're ready. We've mapped out certification times for each state, and we're in touch with elected officials in all the states, and here in Massachusetts as well, though there's not really any problem. And we're going to make sure that the people's vote prevails. What are the key dates? Obviously, December 14th. That's when the members of the Electoral College cast their ballots for president, right? January 6th, there's a special session of Congress. Biden needs 50 votes to be declared the winner. We'll see what happens with the runoff elections in Georgia. A lot of people are paying attention there, obviously. A lot of money and a lot of attention going there. And then January 20th, Inauguration Day. And I have to say, I'm a really nonviolent person, but I was really tickled by the Saturday Night Live news weekend update with Michael Che.
Wasn't he terrific?
The news reports that Trump will have to go kicking and screaming out of the will have to be taken kicking and screaming out of the White House. And then he lifts his martini glass and he goes, okay. So, okay. But what really is all this gaslighting about? Because I do think so. We've seen it. I mean, we've had 4 years of this person gaslighting. Well, so here's some of the things that I've thought, and it could be none of these or all of these. So really, bear with me as I go into the realm of surmising, right? And where I'm not speaking so much from fact, but from conjecture, perhaps. So financially, there are people right now pundits out there on Twitter sphere who are saying that we should really be focusing on the firing of the Secretary of Defense, and the bringing in of and possibly the head of the CIA, and the bringing in of these cronies who are like acting, so they don't have to be approved by the Senate. and that they're going to go in and they're going to delete files, or they're going to grab files, or destroy evidence. And that this is sort of an effort to make sure that wrongdoing, information is power. So seizing information to go against your enemies and then protecting yourself from being prosecuted. And that's really what Trump is about. And he's using all of this stuff around the election to distract the public eye, to distract public attention while they secretly pilfer the government of information and data, which is power and important. And that could have long-term implications. I will tell you, the fact that people are talking about it also means that there are ACLU and other lawyers who are litigating about it already, and trying to prevent that from happening, and filing things like Freedom of Information Act requests and demands and things like that to try to preserve the documents, because it's a crime to destroy documents that are subject to a request or litigation. So there are a lot of lawyers, and I guess what I would just say is a lot of lawyers are going to be employed for a lot of years trying to clean up the mess that's going to come on that. So I don't discount that that's happening, but I'm not really an expert in it. But that's one of the things that I've heard about what this might really be about if there's no legal or political way for Trump to stay in power. I think the other thing is that I think, Trump's looking to his future, and he has a very strong political base. And this is the sobering narrative of the election, is that 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. A politics based on fear and hate and racism. In fact, I heard an NPR commentator recently say that he saw this as a battle, this election as a battle between the people who believe in democracy and those who want to preserve the privileges of white supremacy. So it's like democracy and privileges of white supremacy. I thought that was a really interesting and thoughtful frame to think about it. And that's where I think the challenge and the opportunity lies for all of us who care about democracy and liberty, because we are witnesses to this moment in history, and we can feel how close we came to the abyss. I mean, I'm still not totally relaxed. I'm sleeping better, but not 100%. But think how much work now we have to do to really return our nation to a path of truth and justice, which is what we need to do for the sake of our children and grandchildren. Looking ahead, we have to renew the architecture of our democracy in ways to prevent future autocrats from seizing and abusing power. We really need to strengthen our systems and checks and balances and find a way to really do that, to prevent too much. We relied on norms. We have to prevent future autocrats from being able to seize power, including Donald Trump, who will, of course, be able to say he wants to come back for another 4 years. So that'll give him some strength and power politically. But we also have to continue to do the work of building our justice system with greater urgency. We have to, as individuals and as a nation, just confront and teach our children the history of the truth about this country. We live in this historic part. I think that's why Massachusetts, there are lots of reasons I think Massachusetts is so progressive. I think the fact we have John Adams wrote our state constitution, which was the model for the federal constitution. I think our town government system, as opposed to county government that exists in much of the country, is a very strong pro-democracy. But we also are grounded so deeply in history here. But we have to teach and know for ourselves the shameful bits of our history too, like genocide and slavery, and have to use that knowledge, that painful knowledge, to spur us to build the world that is livable and free and fair and more just. Brian Stevenson, the wonderful Brian Stevens of the Equal Justice Initiative and the Anti-Lynching Memorial, and the movie and the book, he's one of my heroes. But he has a saying, the opposite. He says, the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. So the windows of opportunity may be open, but they're very short. They will close quickly. That we know from history. So we have to act with urgent speed. The COVID pandemic has really exacerbated and highlighted the racial inequalities in our healthcare system, in our employment systems, in our housing systems, in our financial systems. We have to address issues of poverty and racism as public health issues, just as we do the pandemic, and to recognize that I don't protect myself as protect everyone as a public health matter. I do it to protect myself and my family. And the same is true of these other pandemics of poverty and injustice and racism. We have to protect all of us to protect ourselves and to protect our democracy and our way of life. So I think that we have to find ways to do that. I think we need to reimagine policing in the course of that. This isn't about defund the police. You know, that's a moniker that was really raised by the right to describe what people are talking about in social progressive circles. We can't arrest our way out of the ills of our society. Criminalizing poverty or race or mental health illness or substance abuse hasn't worked. We know it hasn't worked. It's filled our prisons and made them COVID breeding grounds. We have to find another way, and we can't expect the police officers who are there to do one job to also serve as social workers and substance use counselors and all these other things. There are other people who are trained to do that. We have to think of a more holistic, if you would, public health approach to public safety, right? To really rethink that and to bring police along as our allies in building this, as opposed to, you know, our enemies. But we have to bring them around, and that's a big, big challenge. Right now here in Massachusetts, well, let me start nationally, we have to reunite still. There are almost 600 children who haven't been reunited with their families. I am so proud of my ACLU colleague, Lee Gallant. You know, he and his team almost single-handedly reunited almost 6,000 children and families who were separated by the Trump administration at the border, right? But there are still 600 or so of those kids who haven't been reunited, and that work continues. And if the federal government would help us as opposed to fight us, we could try to mitigate. We'll never right that wrong, but we can begin to mitigate it and make sure it stops happening. On the immigration front here in Massachusetts, we're still in court, making sure that children who are sick aren't being deported from our hospitals when they come to Boston to try to get medical care. That's an ongoing case that we still have that hopefully will go away under a Biden administration, and that we will have those protections. We need to protect the Dreamers and the TPS people who are here, who are frontline workers and taxpayers. We need to make sure they have a right to have a driver's license to keep us all safe. There are still 60 to 70,000 people in camps along the US-Mexican border in places that are so dangerous, where they're subjected to rape and kidnapping, and they're sleeping on the streets on cardboard mats. We've reunited dozens of families, people who had a connection here in Massachusetts. We've gone to court and able to bring them here. But this administration, the Trump administration, is still trying to deport them back into these camps where they'd be subjected to this kind of abuse. So that kind of work continues and is so urgent, and we need to continue to do that work. Just yesterday, we were in court to try to make sure that there's COVID breaking out in the prisons, that we get people who are not a threat to society to be able to go on GPS bracelets and not remain in prisons. So that kind of work is really important. And then finally, the legislature, which, as you know, is typically they go out of session on July 31st, but they're going to they're now staying until, I'm not sure if it's January 5th or December 31st, but basically the end of the calendar year. And there's so much that we can do yet in this session, including passing greater protections for abortion rights. So women can get access to abortion irrespective of whether they're rich or poor. Should be equal access to healthcare for everyone. That's a big push that we have going on right now. In fact, if you haven't yet, call your legislators and thank them and urge them to vote yes on the budget amendment to protect reproductive justice. That's happening today. We just passed it late last night in the House. It's going over to the Senate, and then it's going to go to Governor Baker's desk. So we want to push that forward to make sure that people have protections, that they can access reproductive health care, despite what's happening in other states. And the other thing that's coming up is going to be the police overhaul bill that's coming up. And this is really important. It includes police licensure and limits on the use of force, like tear gas and rubber bullets and things like that. And also limits on qualified immunity, which is basically puts the risk of police misconduct on the victim because it prevents them from being able to sue police officers who violate their rights, and it's really pernicious. So we've got huge amounts of work yet to do, literally in the next 6 weeks and maybe even month here in Massachusetts. This is a short window that we have where, you know, they can't say that they have to wait till after the election to do the right thing. This is the time to push it forward. And your calls and your anything that you do, your emails, your calls, responding to all the calls for action that come from the League and from the ACLU and all the groups you're involved with, they really do make a difference because our legislature just isn't that big. So 5 calls can be a tipping point and can really make a difference. So thank you for those of you who take those actions. So there's so much work to do, and I'm eager to hear from you about what you think we should be focusing on as we look ahead. But before I close, I just want to say, just for this moment, Let's just take a moment to breathe and celebrate and be grateful that at this very moment in history, the forces of democracy and equality did overcome the forces of white supremacy and authoritarianism. And I'm so proud because the League of Women Voters and the ACLU working together played a big role in making that happen. So thank you.
Carol, that is so inspiring, so informing, so many things all at once. It's the wealth of your knowledge and the opportunities that you, as the leader here in Massachusetts and with people like Andrea Young, have to make a difference is so important. When you look ahead to the next, to the December 14th vote and then to the January 20th inauguration, what can League members and others do to support the ongoing propriety and of the vote and the transformation of power?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think we all go into our holiday season, right? How many of you are also not going to see your in-laws this year? Speak for myself. Right. So, you know, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to find ways to have difficult conversations. So first, I think in terms of the Trump, the steal the election stuff, I think we need to debunk it, just like kind of almost belittle it. I mean, there is a big change, I have to say, in the news reporting from 2016. I think we're going to look back and we're going to see that the news, instead of just reporting without commentary on some of the falsehoods that this administration puts forward, they're saying, you know, the administration said this, but it's not true. Like, I think we just need to keep going back to facts. And yes, there are people who say, I have my facts and you have your facts. And those are hard conversations. But I think it's important that we continue to pay attention, that we stay calm. I mean, another thing that my friend Andrea Young said in Georgia, we were on a meeting with all the 50 executive directors, right? We have a weekly check-in. And she said, could y'all up there in the blue states just like chill out? We got it covered. We're good. Stop. I was like, oh, okay. You know? So I think it's a combination of like being really vigilant and continuing to pay attention, to be prepared to act, but not dousing the flames. Right. I think the calmness, I think, is really important. People are scared. People are jittery. People are cooped up. Right. I think the more that we can just say to each other, stand shoulder to shoulder. There's strength in numbers. We're going to be okay. And I actually think it's important too that people are prepared to take to the streets. This is a political battle. I mean, this is a power battle. This isn't just a legal battle. Right. This is an actual power battle. So I think the notion that local officials that they know where their votes come from. I mean, Governor Baker is a Republican, but he's out there because he knows who voted him into power, right? He knows his positions are, so it's the voters who speak. So the more that people speak out, engage in civil society, the stronger it gets. And so, you know, any opportunity that you have to engage in those, in your town halls, in your League of Women Voters, in your ACLU, whatever, there's lots of volunteer opportunities. Just understand we all have agency. You know, we are the cavalry, so to speak.
That's gorgeous. And that certainly gives us both a calm but a sensible direction to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, we all make a difference.
I'm going to call on Carlin Reed. Carlin, you've been following the chat box. Can you tell us some of pose a question to Carol that you've seen in the chat box that is relevant to our discourse?
Sure, we've had a very active discussion on the chat box, and I want to encourage the viewers when they have a chance to look at it, because there's questions as well as additional information. Here are a couple of questions I think might pique the interest. Janet has asked, how likely is this election experience to cause states to pass legislation to abide by the popular vote rather than by the electoral college? So it's electoral college vote. That's the first question.
That's a really great question. So, you know, there's a lot of push to dissolve the electoral college, which is, you know, grounded in slavery and racism and is distorting. So just saying. That noted, the problem with actually getting rid of it is you'd have to probably have a constitutional convention. And the problem with the Constitutional Convention is it can go sideways really fast. And so there's a lot of hesitation because you can't just open it up for one issue. But the national popular vote is out there, and we, working with the league, I'm going to say 5 years ago, we passed the national popular vote here, saying that we have to abide by the popular vote here in Massachusetts. Our electors can't be faithless electors, so to speak. And I think that we need 2/3 of the states. I'm not sure how many we get to get the popular vote. Someone on the call may have more knowledge on that, but I believe last I read 38 states had done it. So, I mean, I think that might be a really good place to put a lot of energy and time into trying to get that to all the states, and doing that rather than a constitutional convention is to get that through the national popular vote. So I think that's a really good question, and I encourage all of us to take a look at where we can work. But in Massachusetts, we've done that work, but I think in other states we should push for it.
So, Carol, just for clarification, the individual state legislatures would pass a law that says that the popular vote is what determines how the electors will vote.
That they have to be bound by it. Yeah, and somebody in the chat, Louise is writing that we need 270 electoral votes, and we have 196 with Colorado's recent vote. Yeah, so I mean it's within shot, right? So if we're at 196 and we need to get to 270, let's be strategic and figure out where that is. And so I have it on my list of things.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just call the places, you know, I'll be in the conversations where the states don't have that, and we can raise that again. I mean,
that would be, that's so important. Thank you. I know that the National League addresses this issue and cares about it very much.
Yeah.
Carlin, another question, please.
All right, here's number 2. This is from Judy. What is your perspective on redistricting for 2021? Yep.
It's huge. It's a big issue, and here too, you know, I have the privilege of being privy to the conversations with across the 50 state affiliates, and it was pretty funny. Actually, just last week, somebody said to the 50 of us, "Okay, I'm putting together a task force on redistricting. You know, let me know if you're interested." And like every single hand went up. It's kind of like, doesn't look like a task force to me. You know, that looks like a stampede. So we're definitely taking a look at that. And then here in Massachusetts, we'll work with our allies like the League and the Voter Modernization Coalitions and the DEMOS and Common Cause and all of those to work on redistricting here. You know, there's kind of an interesting challenge. So in a lot of states where there's a lot of concern about gerrymandering, the push is to have an independent election, you know, group that does it, that isn't made up of legislators. But here in Massachusetts, there's some argument that no, we actually should keep it in the legislature, because then it's subject to the public records law and to the voters, and it's more democratic. So why would you have the legislators appoint their cronies who are then not subject to the oversight and checks and balances, when you could just have the legislators do it and have it be radically transparent and open? So that's what happened last time around, and it actually went really well. I thought it was just super well run, and I felt like there was a lot of oversight, and we were right in the middle of it, and so was the League, and so was there were a lot of groups, because we have this thick civil society here in Massachusetts, right? So I think it's an interesting question as to, does it make sense to have, you know, but when it comes to Massachusetts, we can go ahead and let the legislature do it because it's controlled by the Democrats. But gee, down there in, you know, Georgia, we need an independent commission. So I'm kind of watching that, because I think I'd like being principled in the stance. But I'm not beyond real politics. Yeah. Thank you for that, Louise.
That's terrific, and that really helps us to form an understanding of the complexity of that issue.
It is complex, yeah.
It is. It's a tough one. Carlin, take it away again, please.
Okay, here's number 3. Do you think our new vice president will take a stronger role in the Senate and reduce Mitch's authority? This is a question from Fred.
Well, Fred, I think it depends on whether she can break a tie, right? So, I mean, I think the best that we're going to get is a 50-50 from my understanding of the current, like, even if both of the runoffs in Georgia break for the Dems, I think then we end up with a 50-50. And so Harris's vote's going to be really important to break a tie. And I have no doubt that she would be fully willing to use that to push things forward. I think, there's a lot of mixed feelings about Harris in the civil rights world because she was a prosecutor for so many years. And so a lot of people felt that she hadn't used that seat of authority to, we just did a What a Difference a DA Makes campaign, a voter education campaign, right? It really matters whether Rachel Rollins is in there or not. It makes a really big difference. That it really matters whether Harris used her power there to perpetuate some of the problems in the criminal system or whether she alleviated them. There's definitely a feeling that she should have been more courageous. Now, whether that would have worked for her politically and whether she would now be the vice president had she done that is an interesting question that we can't really answer. But I don't think she's lacking in guts. So I think if it comes to breaking a tie, she can be right there. I don't think she's meek and mild. So like her for that.
If Fred's question leaned a little bit on the fact that she's been in the Senate and that she knows that she has.
That's a good point too. Yeah, excellent.
I wonder if that will make a difference in the sense that she's
Well,
not a stranger to that body, is she?
Right, and Biden too. I mean, will it matter that that they know people there? I would like to think it would. I would like to think that some of those issues of comity will work. And it'll be interesting to see where the Lisa Murkowskis and Collins and people like that are how they're gonna play. And it's very hard to know, again, the political landscape with Trump raising all this money right now. I mean, that's the other thing that I should have mentioned, that there's been all these stories about how the money that's going to, stop the steal the vote thing is actually going into his other coffers to build his political future and not going to only gifts above 5,000, which there are probably very few, would go to then actually address the steal the vote stuff, what they're calling it, so-called steal the vote. So I think he's going to have some kind of a influential platform. And I just don't know, as we watch, is the future of the Republican Party going to be Charlie Baker or is it going to be Mitch McConnell? I don't think we know.
We don't know, do we? Particularly after what we've just seen in the national vote.
Right.
Carlin, another question, please.
Sure. Here's a question from Peggy. Peggy wants to know, are you worried about keeping the attention of the volunteers who paid attention to this election? She's thinking about what happened in the 2010 election versus the 2008 election.
Yeah.
So keeping the attention of volunteers. What do you think?
Oh God, yes. No, it's really a big, I mean, just to show you by in terms of numbers for the ACLU here in Massachusetts. So when I first came in, which was 2003, so that was Bush, we had 10,000 ACLU members in Massachusetts, okay? It went up to 22 because of like Guantanamo and NSA spying, remember all those things? Went up to 22,000 people. Then when after Obama was elected, it dropped back down to 14,000. So it went from 10 to 22 to 14. When Trump came in, because of the travel ban and the separating of kids from their parents at the border, the immigrant separation cases, ACLU membership in Massachusetts went to 86,000. Like crazy quintupling. I'm talking, small donors, people who just joined for their $20 a year and got an ACLU membership. That has probably dropped now down to 40s, right? And so the question is, I think it is likely to go down because people will start to feel like, oh good, the problem's taken care of, when of course it's not. I mean, we're just only that far back from the abyss, the problem's not taken care of. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to continue the conversation that we've started with our volunteers, that we've started with our membership, to keep them engaged and to make them realize that we need them to build the protections to prevent this from happening again and to actually move our country forward. And so, I think part of it is going to be for me and for, I think a lot about letting go. I'm very excited by the new generations of organizers and people coming in. They come up with ideas that initially often seem crazy to me and then turn out to work, and they're great. And so I'm really learning about creating space and letting other people build and bloom of all ages. And, so whether we're talking about, we also work with the League, we also work with Concord and other indivisible groups. And I think they're fantastic, and People Power and, all the other Move On and all the groups. So this is really about movement building. And I think the other thing I would say is I think if people don't see the changes that they're marching for, the existential threats, economic and climate change and racial justice, these really existential challenges for our country. If they don't see that change, they'll get disillusioned. So I think it's incumbent upon us to urge our elected officials to use the levers of democracy and urge them that they must make these changes, or else people will take to the streets. And then you have all sorts of things that go sideways. So, I think it's a challenge. I'm anticipating that it will go down somewhat, but I'm also redoubling our efforts to stay engaged, because I think the importance of the mission is actually greater, and the danger, we have a little chance to protect against this happening again. And I worry that next time we'll go over the abyss. So I'm highly motivated, and I hope we can keep other people motivated.
And Carol, that's the challenge, isn't it? Between the kind of intensity internally in our stomachs and our bodies, whether it was just over the last year or over 4 years, and that sense of, and yet we can't really go, can we? We need to take a moment and then continue our attentive vigilance to the things for which the League and the ACLU, and I'm sure the members on this call, to which each of us is committed.
Our organizations have been around for 100 years each, 100 years. Like, that's not because we've stayed the same. That's because we've learned to adapt and change and to remain relevant. And that's the challenge before us. And it's actually a pretty exciting challenge because people are engaged right now. So, and I think, again, here in Massachusetts in particular, our particular form of city and town government gives us an ability. So whether we're passing local immigrant welcoming resolutions, or resolutions that say that you shouldn't be using biometric surveillance on the civilian population. Pretty basic things. And if we can get them at the local levels, then it becomes pretty easy to go to the state legislature and get it at the state level. And then we can begin to scale up to other states, right? And so we in Massachusetts have a particular opportunity and obligation both to innovate and try new things, because we can start at town and local levels and then build it up. And that is how you get deep systems change, because we have a 100-year time horizon together. So we get to do it.
For those of you who are avid readers, Cast by Isabel Wilkerson.
Great book.
Who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns, which is one of the most exquisite things works I've read maybe in my lifetime. But Cast is another way of looking at, and to help us to look at, issues of endemic racism. And how is it not to become an anti-racist, or how not to become a racist, or
how to be an anti-racist.
How to be an anti-racist.
Another great book.
It's a powerful book. And in combination, I think one ends up realizing the degree to which policy and the degree to which kind of innocent, and I think it's reasonably innocent, innocent racism can inadvertently subvert our best intentions.
Yeah, so it's an awakening that we all, I'll speak for myself, that I've really embraced with an open mind. Yep. And an open heart, because I think failure to do so, and it's heavy sometimes, but I think a failure to do that is not only ahistorical and thus sort of anti-intellectual, but actually dangerous. I think as a species, we need to change the way we do what we've always done. And the structural racism that's just inherent in so many of our systems, when you begin to see it, when you begin to learn how to see it, then you can begin to address it. We have to name things. I'll never forget Kitty McKinnon years ago, back in the 70s, I think it was. She came out with this new concept no one had ever heard of, which was date rape. No one had ever heard of date rape, right? Now everybody knows what that means, right? But she took a phenomenon, she analyzed it, and she gave it a name. And by giving it a name, we were able to address it and to begin to fight it, right? But if something's happening and you don't see it, because we all have blind spots, I know I do. But when we begin to see things and then name it, then you begin to overcome it. And I think that sort of trying to help people to set down their fear and to be able to find a way forward is really the challenge for our groups, because we do have that advantage of historical history and a hindsight that I think makes us some of the wisest of the two civil rights groups that are around. And we can play well in the sandbox with other groups too. That's really important.
And I just wanted to note that we have the privilege of having Patricia Comfort, who is our Massachusetts Executive Director of our league, on this call. And
wonderful.
And she has just put some information in the chat box as to Massachusetts positions on things. So welcome and thank you. Carlin, your turn. Another question.
I can tell this is a very popular topic because we have lots of questions and comments in the chat box. Julie, our president for the league, has noted that you should find a save chat under the 3 dots in the chat box. So I appreciate that from Julie. Okay, here's a couple of questions. And I don't know how much more time we have for this, but let's take a look at this question here. Okay, from Phyllis, any advice for how to build up the vote and voter protection in Georgia? Are there any particular alliances to seek out and share efforts with? That's from Phyllis.
Sorry, could you repeat it? Because the sounds broke up right at the beginning of the question.
My apologies. This is from Phyllis. Do you have any advice for how to build up the vote and voting protection in Georgia? Are there any particular alliances to seek out and share efforts with?
I would send everybody to the ACLU of Georgia and Andrea Young. She's like making it happen. They got literally tens of thousands of people off the voter rolls. Her people, and she's not just working alone. There's national voting rights staff there, but she's at the center of it. She's great. I mean, her dad was the mayor of Atlanta. She's a real political connected person, and I think that she and Stacey Abrams, who are best friends, are kind of making stuff happen. And if they're not the right people, they'll send you to the right people. But I would say I would start with them, either of them or both of them, if you can, or their people. Because I think they've been historic. And I think when the history is written on this moment about what happened in Georgia, we're going to look at these 2 Black women and say, look at them. And all the other, by the way, she was telling me all the other Black women who've taken power in school boards and town councils and everything. What happened in Georgia, I think, is going to be literally an important case study on effective advocacy. So I would say go there. And what did she say to me? She said, we're coming for the Senate, and then we're going to take the governor's office. I was like, all right, you're going to be at the ACLU much longer. She sounds pretty partisan to me, but hallelujah, man. I'm glad she's there.
Well, you know, the role of women in all of this has been profound.
Yes.
And when all of this is finally settles and we can look back on it all, it will be the role of the ACLU, the role of League of Women Voters, and just in general, the role of clear, powerful, strong women, not angry women, but clear women.
Yeah.
And that
it matters.
That distinction is so important, and you express it so beautifully, Carol, just in your being. We've got plenty of time for questions, so let's keep going.
Okay.
Carlin, another question, please.
You bet. Here's another one. This comes from Court. Court asks, is there any sound evidence about trends among young voters? I've heard alarming evidence about the percentage expressing willingness to accept more authoritarian forces in exchange for more stability, and court puts stability in quotes.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I was just reading about this day before yesterday, that the voters, the greatest percentage, the age group that voted the most for Trump was 30 to like 40, right? Or like 30 to 49. I mean, it was like the 30 and 40-year-olds, which kind of, I think Court kind of reinforces like the conjecture that maybe these are the people who, you know, they're trying to start their families, they're trying to keep their jobs, they're just very, you know, they're trying to have their prime of life, right? And but that the 20 to 30-year-olds came out a lot, you know, in the Sunrise Movement and the youth, that age cohort showed up in droves and did a lot. And so that's a really interesting distinction. And then the older voters also voted for Biden. But so we're seeing this sort of middle age cohort who seems to be acting more from fear. I mean, when I think about the people who do that, I don't think it's, well, some of them are just evil racists. Yes. Okay. But a lot of them are just fearful and ignorant, fear and ignorance, right? Those great wants. And they're vulnerable to it because they're stressed and they've got COVID and they're trying to raise their kids and their kids aren't going to school. And I mean, I see my staff, those are the people definitely under the most stress from everything else. You know, at the same time, I mean, I think, and again, the ACLU is nonpartisan, so I'm more an observer of the partisan politics you know, when I speak about this stuff. But look what happened with Ed Markey. You know, it was the Sunrise Movement that got Ed Markey elected over an overwhelmingly many ways, sort of the youth, the future, right? Joe Kennedy is the future in so many ways. And Ed Markey is an older person, is sort of like, he's been around, like, but then he got, you know, AOC, and he got the Sunrise Movement, those kids behind him. That's really interesting. And I think there are lots of lessons to be taken from that, because they know how to organize, and they're motivated, and they're angry, and they're willing to get out there, right? And they're not worried about taking care of toddlers. So, I mean, I think there's some interesting dynamics that I think we're going to be studying this for a while. But that's the trends that I've been seeing very early on in reading, sort of like as people look back and try to analyze what happened since the pollsters got it so wrong. Oh my God. But I think, you know, we can look back, and then we can start to pull that apart. And obviously the other big thing in terms of the trends, so there's the age trends, and then there's the race trends. I mean, you know, white men and white women overwhelmingly, you know, came out for Trump. And, you know, is that just, again, fear? Or is it just blatant racism, or some combination of both? It's so hard to know. You know, and it's a little bit like the banality of evil, right? So I think we have a lot of work to do, and that's where the urgency of putting in and addressing the sense of fear, the sense of things being out of control around the virus, around the economy, around the environment, all of these things, around civil rights. We need to address those with this urgency, because I think that is, you know, John Kennedy said, and I probably Schlesinger wrote, but John Kennedy said, you know, those who make peaceful, gotta give credit where credit's due, right? But those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. You know, and I think it's important that as a matter of our democracy and our public health and our public safety, that we pull together and move quickly. And that doesn't mean, and so the challenge of the stalling with gridlock government that we have is going to push the power to the states. So we in the states can begin to move. And again, just like when the cities and towns help us get stuff passed in the legislature, when the state legislatures start to do the right thing, then the nation follows, right? The courts aren't going to save us, obviously. But, you know, they kind of never did. The courts are not calling balls and strikes, right? They're either ideological, or they're actually, but they're always political, right? So just think about what happened with the equal marriage, right? The Obergefell case came in 2015, right? But we in Massachusetts started back in the early 2000s, in 2004 in the court, in 2007 in the legislature. And I saw Norma Shapiro's on here. Hi, Norma. She's the reason we have equal marriage in Massachusetts and no death penalty. It's Norma Shapiro.
Absolutely. So we're going to have her here. I was going to mention her name. Please go.
But, you know, the facts changed on the ground, and then the court acknowledged it, right? We need to change the facts on the ground, and then the courts will follow. The courts will acknowledge, and so will Congress. So politicians follow the voters. So that's why this voter mobilization work that we do with the League is just so important, because that's how actual political change and lasting political change comes about. And I think we have this opportunity to build on the mobilization that's come out of this election.
Before Carla and I scooted to you, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but I want to ask you to address a question that you touched on, which has to do with, let's use the example of the cybersecurity institute and its head. He has been speaking out and saying there is nothing wrong with the vote, and he's the one that oversees the international, perhaps, interference with our vote through security. Were Trump to remove him, and there's some discussion that he might, or to remove people under him, which he's already done. Does the ACLU have any ability to challenge that kind of decision on a presidential level?
You know, it's a really great question.
Congress to do something like that, and how does that work?
Yeah, you know, I don't know the answer offhand, but I'll try to find it. Like, what are the actual levers that you could go in? I mean, you can always file a lawsuit. I mean, you know,
apparently,
slow step down. We learned that from Trump, right? You can always file whether it's a meritorious law or a winning lawsuit is a different thing. But I think that there are already people that are going in there trying to prevent the law, what I've heard about are the lawsuits that are trying to prevent the actual actions rather than preventing him from firing people, but just preventing the people who are there from destroying documents and stealing data and that kind of stuff. But I'm not sure what the levers are to actually prevent him from firing people and then putting other people in. I mean, he's attacking the civil service already.
Right.
And so some of the early stuff, one would hope that the Biden administration can go in fairly quickly and try to mitigate that harm and restore some of that. And I know, and somebody on this call, because you're also so knowledgeable, I think, isn't there a rule that says that you can undo executive orders that were made 60 days or some percentage of days before? Because remember, they did that for a lot of Obama stuff, right, when the Trump people first got in.
Yeah, they sure did. If there's somebody on the call, you just raise your hand or put something in the chat box and we'll be able to turn to you.
Right. But that's a great question, Diane, and I'll go try to find an answer.
Yeah, I'm anxious and curious.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
And Judy tells us that the Senate needs to approve that. So that may well be true.
Thank you.
Yeah, Carlin, more questions.
Okay, sure. Here's one that actually got 2 votes. It's from, but I didn't know that we had a voting contest on this. This is from Susan. Okay, Susan asks, while it's clear that we have to encode behavioral norms for presidents, do we have some laws like the Hatch Act and the Emoluments Clause? I'm sorry, it wasn't a question. We do have some laws, the Hatch Act and the Emoluments Clause. Why were they not enforced?
Well, first of all, there are still some pending lawsuits on that. Unfortunately, like with the courts, we just don't know where these courts are going to be. They're mostly going to be in the Federal Circuit Court in DC, you know, where those are going to come up. And that's a real mixed bench. And then, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court is pretty bad right now. You know, one can hope that if we can find some originalist arguments to make. I mean, we managed, not we, I mean, just in general, lawyers managed in the, well, actually that was some ACLU lawyers in the last term to get some rulings on, you know, reproductive justice and some immigration cases and stuff, because we were able to make arguments that we hadn't traditionally made, you know, to try to win the votes. So, you know, we'll have to see if we can do that. I do have to tell you all, I confess, when my legal director first came in after Trump was elected and said, now we all have to become experts on emoluments, I was thinking of face cream. I was like, what are you talking about? It's like exfoliant. I was like, what? We have learned a lot in the last 4 years about where the depths of the law and what it can and cannot do and the places where there are holes. And one of the things I feel really passionate about is a reconstruction, if you would, project, or I don't like anything about going backwards, so I want to go forward, but we need to restore our system of checks and balances and put in some more checks clearly with enforcement mechanisms and make it really clear. So the original intent in the law is really clear, and to really fix our democracy. So while I strongly believe we need to do the liberty work of racial justice and equality, I also strongly believe we need to do this democracy work of fixing that. And the one person that I've heard, have seen writing about this so far is Jack Goldsmith out of Harvard Law School. He was, I think, in Bush's.
His stuff is really interesting right now.
Yeah. So he's, I know, been looking at that. I know there are other people, and it's something that I care a lot about, and I'm hoping to sort of begin to turn attention to. I think if I know that there would be people down in Washington who are interested, but I think there could be people in the Boston legal community also interested, and maybe we can do some sort of a set of recommendations of specific things, and then ask our congressional or delegation to try to move some stuff. And we've got a great delegation right now. So, you know, those are the kinds of hard work, roll up the sleeves, pass some laws, work together. And it may or may not be glamorous, but it sure as hell is important.
I think the House just passed it's really all it is now is a set of recommendations for structural changes. And
yeah, no, I think Schumer's office may have come, or no, not Schumer, because it was the House. Anyway,
and it was really
I saw that.
It's based on that writing. Actually, it's very interesting.
Right. So I think that's the kind of stuff that we should be
looking at,
getting our heads into, lifting up.
You know, there's such a difference. We've discovered there's such a difference between what are rules and what is just the accepted civility of behavior.
Isn't that true?
Is there such a thing as over legislating? is there such a thing as making too many rules where in fact we rely just on the dignity and the decency of people?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I mean, I'm not I'm an ACLU person. I'm anti-authoritarian by nature, right? It's like, but, I think of it, I'm also a parent, and I remember when my kids were little, I used to say to them, if they were tantruming or being bad, I would say, do you need a rule? Do you need me to give you a boundary? Because, man, I'll come in here and give you a boundary. If you need a boundary, I'm going to give it to you. And there was, no, mommy, don't give me a boundary. I'll be good. I was nice. I didn't actually hurt them. But, it was sort of like, do you need a rule? Really? Because I think we all want to be as free as we can. Right. I'm a big believer in personal liberty and freedom, but that means that comes with responsibility. So when people abuse that freedom, I think that there's a real danger that we then try to legislate everything, right? And then that leads us into a backlash against it. And then you have a sort of negative authoritarian vibe. So I actually am a big believer in public education and in voluntary compliance. I mean, think about the Let's Make Smoking History campaign. I mean, prohibition failed, but Let's Make Smoking History has pretty much made it so that, the handful of people who still smoke cigarettes go outside, right? And that was done through public education, right? And I think that when we're seeing that too, I hope with our COVID responses, the mandates are really problematic, but when you begin to educate people and make it cool, unlike what Trump did, make it cool to wear a mask and to socially distance and to find ways to do that, I think you get more compliance. I think your public health experts, and there are probably some on this call, would say you get more compliance when people self-regulate because they want to do it than when they do it because there's a rule, and then you get the anti-authoritarian reaction. So I still think we need to do both, but we can make public investments in that kind of public education. I mean, that, in other words, there's still a role for government. It may or may not be a mandate or a rule in all cases. Although there may be in some cases, but I think we get greater compliance when we invest those same resources, not in criminalization, but rather in public health approaches, public health and public safety approaches. So that's where I think we should be making our investments.
Thank you. That's a terrific answer. Carlin, a question, and we've got a raised hand, but I'm going to go to Carlin next again.
Okay, a couple questions have asked about the polls. Susan, different from the previous question, Susan asks, can we trust the polls, the data about what people actually do feel about gun control, healthcare, racism, etc.? And I'm going to combine with my own question, which is, why did the pollsters get it so wrong?
There's been a lot of analysis going on that I've been reading, following on that. I mean, it sounds like it's a combination of, who has cell phones. It's a combination of who's willing to talk to somebody. There was a great comment, like you can't call Mississippi as a surveyor with your Boston accent, which I thought was really funny. They just won't talk to you.
Whoops, Carol, we can't hear you for just a minute. Can everybody hear her and I'm the only one who can't? Or Julie, could you unmute and tell me, can you hear her?
No, we have lost Carol's sound.
Carol, you may have to go back and come back in again, because
Yeah, let me take a look and see if there's anything I can do from here.
You didn't touch anything on your computer, Carol, or?
Okay, I think we have dropped Carol for a minute and we're going to see if we can get her back on.
In the meanwhile, Carlin, you're watching questions about around what do they swirl?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are.
Yes, there you are. Thank you.
Okay, great. I think the system's saying we've gone too long.
No, we actually have until 11, and so we're doing pretty well. So let's keep. We have about another 10 to 15 minutes. So, Carl, you want to repeat your question?
Sure. The question was about the polls. It was Susan's question about, can we trust the polls? And my combined question is, why do the pollsters get it so wrong?
Right. So I think the analysis I've been following is saying the pollsters got it wrong for a range of reasons, but related to things like who has cell phones, who's willing to answer a poll call or question. And I think the level of distrust that this administration has put out about the world in general has made it really hard for the pollsters to operate. You know, there was a comment, and I don't know if you heard me say it before, about, you know, don't have people with a Boston accent making polling calls in Mississippi kind of thing. And so I think that the pollsters are really running up against a technological problem of not being able to figure out how to reach people who might otherwise be in different media channels and getting their information through different paths than what the pollsters are using. So I don't think that we can necessarily trust the national polls in the same way. I still think that polling works pretty well when we're talking about small, like in geographic regions like Massachusetts voters, like likely Massachusetts voters. I tend to think that might be more accurate, but I'm really not an expert. So I know that's just what I've been following and reading, but I don't think we can trust the polls. That's just because I do the math. So.
Yeah, it was clear that we were wrong again in terms of the polls.
Yeah, but I know.
Yeah,
some of my best friends are pollsters.
Yeah, Tanya, you have a question. So I'm going to unmute.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm watching this with my son here, and he typed in a question about the voting rights and the Florida felons' rights. What I wanted to very briefly say is that when there was this mention about apparently one can always start a lawsuit or go to the courts anytime, that is true, but it's important to note that it's when one has the funds to do that. So not everybody is able to countersue or defend properly when somebody who has the means just goes and sues right and left for even frivolous lawsuits. That in itself may be a reason to make the law more specific. And then at least one can make arguments without needing a lawyer. The other thing, and I fully endorse all the comments made both by Ms. Rose and also some chat comments about education being very important, so the public is informed.
Tanya, do you have a question?
Do I have a question?
It's really a time to ask questions of Carol.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess well, I would say how best to handle the inequality in abilities to file lawsuits. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Tanya, I think that's a really wonderful point, and I want to really lift it up and thank you for raising it. You know, the ACLU, we don't charge our clients money, but we also don't do direct legal services. We do impact and structural law reform. And I think we as a society, as we think about what we're building, need to make access to justice more equal. And that's where, you know, the work of direct social legal services and CPCS are so tremendously important. And we've gone to court many times to make sure that, for example, public defenders are paid comparable to prosecutors. So the prosecutors aren't rich and the public defenders are unable to, people can't afford to become public defenders or direct service legal service providers. So one thing is to expand that. So people shouldn't be expected to have to represent themselves. They should be able to get a lawyer regardless of their economic situation. And I think that kind of law reform, and the other part would be called civil Gideon. So that would be that people who have non-criminal cases also get support and get an access to a lawyer, just like people who are in a criminal case. With regard to Florida, and hooray for your son for raising that, the felon disenfranchisement is a really big deal. So here in Massachusetts, it's still true that if you're convicted of a felony while you're serving your time, you can't vote. But thanks to, there's Norma Shapiro again, and others from the ACLU before my time, once you've served your time, then you can vote, right? But in Florida, because this is a state law, these are state law rules. In Florida, there were literally millions of people who had served their time, but they couldn't vote, something like 1.3 million people. So the National ACLU and the Florida ACLU worked together and passed a ballot initiative to enable people who had served their time to be able to vote, called felon disenfranchisement. They overcame that. It was pretty historic. And I have to say, and to the point about why economics matters, it took a lot of money for the ACLU and other groups to pour into that ballot initiative to win that. So it does take resources of groups like the ACLU, because individuals will never have the money to challenge big.
That's so important. And of course, then the legislature in Florida turned around and said, well, if you have any debt that you owe, you can't vote, that you've accumulated while you were in prison. And so that in some ways ended up, and I know that Michael Bloomberg went down with his $100 million intending to make those folks available to vote. And I'm just talking a little bit while we get your voice back, Carol. And in the meanwhile, I suspect you can hear us. And so I'm going to ask Lana Zamaro, who has her hand raised, if she would like to ask a question. Lana?
Hi, thank you. And thank you to the League, Concord Carlisle, for this really incredible and helpful and relief-inducing session with Carol. So here's my question, and this is more long game stuff. And I know we're very focused on the more immediate situation, but I recall saying somewhere that there was a time in our sort of media history where there was a national conversation that was sort of initiated and picked up across the states to talk about a topic. I cannot recall what the topic is or was exactly, but it was quite something. And I'm thinking around this issue of racial injustice. I don't know that we would hit everyone for sure, and maybe it would be just a continuation of talking to the choir. But I'm wondering if there is any kind of an equivalent program, because my concern, having been in public education for 35 years as a teacher and principal, is that our education system has not been forthwith with regard to our real history. And how do we get that out there in a way that, you know, in addition to trying to work through the public school system, but also just to engage the public? I mean, it just seems there's a lot of momentum now around that issue. So just throwing it out, hoping there's somebody with a better memory than mine who remembers what I'm referring to.
Thank you, Lana. I wanted to say that Concord's library system has offered a town-wide opportunity to discuss this issue. And I know our local league has, but Carol, what do we know about statewide opportunities?
You know, I'm sorry, my sound is coming in and out. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Okay, so Lana, thank you for that. I heard just a little bit of it. I think one of the things that's sort of at a national level is to try to make sure that the monopoly that the Texas public schools have over public school books is broken.
Right.
Silly, and there are people who understand that better. Yeah, I see you, Mary Sterling. You know, so that is one thing that I really think we have to do, because that's really problematic. And then I think the kind of forums that the ACLU and the League do, and creating opportunities and internships and reaching out to schools and talking about curriculum development. You know, we had a program for a number of years at the ACLU of Massachusetts called Rights Matter, where we were trying to go into the schools and to have a civil rights and civil liberties curriculum. And ultimately, when we ended up with the MCAS and the high stakes testings, the teachers were so focused on having to teach to the test, because that's what they were being judged by, that it was really hard to get in there with a more creative curriculum. I mean, we worked with like curriculum developers and stuff. This was not just a fly-by-night thing. But I wonder if there might be an opportunity to go back and to begin some of that work again right now. So I'd be open to hearing from those of you who are educators in this room, and I know you're there. See you. You know, I'd be open to.
We've lost your sound again, Carol.
I've been thinking a lot of public education and a renewed effort and focus on that.
Well, thank you. And there are all sorts of people on this call who care deeply about education and are committed to making, if nothing else, for people to just understand how the government works, much less how it might work.
And I do want to give a shout out to librarians. But anybody here who's a librarian, I love you. Thank you. I think librarians are the most radical thinkers that we have in our society. So I know you're quiet, but you're radical, and I just want to give a shout out because they are the people who keep so much of our democracy flowing. So I want to just say that.
That's gorgeous. You're amazing, Carol.
No, I'm just been around long enough to figure a few things out about democracy.
It is gorgeous. Carlin, a question.
Yes, this is from earlier. We had a discussion about the bills that are being passed at the state legislature. This question is from Joanne, and Joanne wants to know, has Governor Baker indicated what he will do with the bills that you mentioned should they reach his desk? That's from Joanne.
So yes and no, Joanne. No, in the sense that he has, in general, has this rule which he won't say whether or not he'll support a bill until it's on his desk. So he doesn't publicly, he won't come out in favor or against things very often. That's one of his political trademarks, that he does that. That noted, I will tell you that the leadership in the state legislature talks to Charlie Baker a lot, and they don't want to pass things that he's going to veto unless they know they have a veto-proof override. But in general, and it's interesting because despite the fact that Baker's a Republican and the legislature is overwhelmingly comprised of Democrats, they tend to talk to each other, work together, and either get stuff done or not get stuff done. Too often it's not get stuff done. So my guess is that stuff isn't going to come out that he's likely to veto. Now, he might veto elements of something like more of a line item if he would veto. But that's my general sense. And so on, for example, the Roe Act stuff that's happening right now, there were compromises. I mean, legislation is always, you go into court with the litigators and either you win or you lose, right? The judge rules for you or against you, right? With the legislation, you always compromise. And so you always both win and lose. It's kind of heartbreaking advocacy in that way, although I love it. And so, I think we're going to get something on criminal law reform. I think we're going to get something on reproductive justice. I'm sad to say I'm hearing that we're not going to get anything on immigration reform. And I'm horrified by that because, Arizona has done better during Trump on immigration than Massachusetts. That's terrible. We need to really, I think, rethink how we're talking about immigration and to go back and to get some serious protections for people who are here, most undocumented people are part of a mixed family where some people are documented and some are not. They are on the front lines. We did our Technology for Liberty. We have a Tech for Liberty program where we bring in technologists to analyze data and present it out. It's really great. If you check it out on our website, aclum.org, and Data for Justice is the name of the project. We did some overlay of where the ethnic breakdown in neighborhoods in Massachusetts, and then frontline workers, and then COVID and incidents. And it just tracks as you would expect, but it's so amazing to see that data right there. So I just think the legislature, as a matter of morality, needs to take something about immigration. But I don't think they're going to this legislative session, unfortunately.
But the other is encouraging. Let's hope. Carlin, this is the last question. So is there one last question that we can ask of Carol?
Absolutely. Here it is. This is from Linda. Linda wants to know, what are your thoughts on getting police reform legislation through this session in Massachusetts? And what do you think legislative priorities will be for the new Massachusetts legislature? She adds in a third question, what actions should we be taking to help shape them? I think those are good questions to end on.
Great questions. Yeah, no, that's great. So in terms of the police overhaul bill, I think it's going to get voted on. Charlie Baker wanted the licensure bit. Liz Miranda's use of force bill, I think, is going to go. I don't know if we'll get a qualified immunity limit or not, but if we don't, we should come back. And that should be a big deal. And I'm happy to talk about that at some other time when we have more time, but it's really a common sense reform that we should have the legislature adopt. In terms of the next legislative session, I really think we need to be confronting basic inequities and inequalities. People are on the streets marching about inequality in Massachusetts and everywhere else. And we have to do it against the backdrop of our COVID response and making sure that there's equity in who gets the vaccines and how that gets rolled out. And so I think those, and then this is not ACLU necessarily, although there are civil rights implications of it, but I think we need to address climate change because it's going to begin to create internally displaced people and migrant populations, and all of us are going to be affected by it. So I don't think that we can really, you know, the planet's going to be fine. It's the human species that's not going to be okay. So I think that we need to address that as an existential threat and challenge and opportunity, because I always see the glass half full. So thanks.
That's gorgeous, and that's a wonderful way, you know, for us to conclude this, the glass half full. And Carol, you've given that to us in so many ways this morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much. I wanted a couple of thanks. In the background has been Court Booth, who's been managing all sorts of admits and not admits and not admits, but admits. So Court, thank you so much. Carlin, thank you for fielding the questions so beautifully. Again, a shout out to Nancy Bucas for helping us to realize how important this is and to focus on it. And of course, most importantly, Carol, a thank you to you. And I think we have a final word from Julie Rowing, our president.
Love my league.
That was an amazing discussion. I also want to thank Carol Rose for participating and Diane for moderating, and Court and Peggy Wergelin, who is doing the recording this morning. To everyone else, thank you for joining us. I hope we will see you at future events. For more information on Concord Carlisle League activities, you could visit our website at lwvcc.org, or you can email me at president@lwvcc.org with your questions or for further information. And I hope we'll see many of you back again next month when we're talking to the Director of Concord Public Works.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Bye-bye.
thank everyone who joined us. It's been an extraordinary morning.